We now move from enforcement of cybercrime to the prosecution and the progress and challenges that exist today. The Cyber and Intellectual Property Crimes section was created in 1996 to investigate and prosecute high-tech crimes, including both cyber-based attacks on the nation's electronic infrastructure and economic crimes committed using computers, as well as intellectual property crimes such as theft of intellectual property and economic espionage. In December 2014, the Cybersecurity Unit within the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section was created. Its purpose is to serve as a central hub for expert advice and legal guidance regarding how the criminal electronic surveillance and computer fraud and abuse statutes impact cybersecurity. This unit is instrumental in helping to shape cybersecurity legislation to protect our nation's computer networks and individual victims from cyber attacks. Within the Justice Department's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, Michael Mick Stawasz serves as Deputy Chief for Computer Crime. Mr. Stawasz leads a team of federal prosecutors who engage in worldwide efforts to detect, disrupt, and deter cybercrime. Every Computer Fraud and Abuse Act prosecution in the United States comes to Mr. Stawasz for consultation. He also heads the department's experts on the proper collection and use of electronic evidence. In addition, Mr. Stawasz was the first head of the Criminal Division's previously referenced Cybersecurity Unit. Please welcome to the stage Deputy Chief for Computer Crime, United States Department of Justice Criminal Division, Michael Mick Stawasz.
I'm going to say just a few words real quick. Before Mick gets on, just a few words from the conference administrator, so to speak. For all the speakers in the room and for anyone who's just purely interested in being a part of the podcast that we have going on today and tomorrow, we do have a podcast very back of this room or just beyond these doors here. So if you're interested in talking about anything as it relates to infrastructure, security, IT, cybersecurity, convergence, insider threat, third party, you name it, the list goes on. We would obviously welcome your comments. So consider that a resource for you to have your 15 minutes of fame right in the back of the room. With that, Mick, talking a little bit about how to keep the bad guys out. Thank you.
Thank you. It is great to be back. I heard one person after yesterday that regularly attends the other flagship event for GBEF in Las Vegas said, it's nice to see you regular size instead of 35 feet high on a screen. But I really appreciated the chance to appear remotely for the last CES, and I'm thrilled to be here in person this time. I wanted to just start because the last time I spoke was in fall of 2021 over in Tyson's Corner. And at that time, Dr. West said, just share with the audience a little bit about what you've been doing. I think it helps them give a perspective on what you do, because this conference is really unique. The speakers don't typically hit the stage and then hit the bricks. I'm here the entire time, so if you hear something in what I'm talking about that interests you and you want to follow up with me, by all means, come up to me at the breaks, talk to me at other times. To give you a little bit of an idea, I am going to rush through some very broad topics. I am not going to say everything I think about on every topic, so I do encourage you, if something interests you, please come talk to me later. But what are some of the things that your tax dollars are buying? What has Mick been doing? Well, we recently concluded an international treaty on electronic evidence with 56 other countries, so we're pretty proud of that. We seized $3.6 billion in virtual assets that were stolen from one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges online. That, by some measures, is in fact the largest seizure the Department of Justice has ever done. The Vice President actually announced a new task force to deal with online abuse. Here we're talking about the highest level threats, perhaps the lowest incident threats, but the highest level threats, nation-state attacks, transnational organized crime. But there is a lot of harm to Americans going on every day, from cyber stalking, from doxing, from swatting. People know what swatting is? You wouldn't believe how easy it is to call and make a fake report and get armed police to respond to your victim's location and scare the bejesus out of them, and it's even turned deadly at times. So we are focused on those threats as well. They also significantly impact Americans. Also, we just, as you heard from EDGE22, cleaned off a Russian botnet from hundreds of computers. Now, I understand that's controversial. I thought the assistant director did an incredible job of explaining why the department felt it was necessary. But there are people out there worried that people like me, people like EDGE22 are making decisions about whether your computer is secure enough, and if we don't think it is, going in and changing it. We did that with careful consideration, with lots of people involved, and critically, like he said, with court approval. So I actually have a really shiny bauble on my shelf at home, an Attorney General's Award for changing that very law that EDGE22 referenced several times, Rule 41. I'm not going to go into the sort of specifics of it, but we did the prep work 8 years ago in anticipation of needing to do these types of operations, changed the law to be ready to do it. So your government is thinking ahead. You heard Brian talk about anticipation. This is a great example. We anticipated this was where things were going, we changed the law to be ready for it, and we did it in a responsible way. And I applaud the FBI. The first time you do anything is terrifying. The first time you go in and change people's computers, you better get it right. And they got it right. So congratulations to everybody involved in that operation. We also took down not just a Russian botnet, but a transnational organized crime botnet, EMOTET. So you heard a lot about the fact that there's sometimes blurred lines between the two efforts, criminal groups and nation states. That is certainly true. You also heard Congressman Issa talk about needing to have the types of weapons that deter nation states from attacking the United States. Not going to disagree with that, but we've never nuked a transnational organized cybercrime group. We are going to need other tools to deal with transnational organized cybercrime because they are almost as impactful and in some ways more impactful than the nation-state threat. We know how to deter nation-state threats. Transnational organized criminal groups are different, and that's where I focus my time. The last thing is I just got back from The Hague. Thankfully, long enough ago that I am recovered from COVID and not contagious. But did come home from The Hague with COVID, but went there for a really important purpose. And it is because in order to deal with these transnational organized crime threats, and specifically ransomware, we are going to need to cooperate with the people we can cooperate with. And Europe is certainly a group we can cooperate with. So we went over there to talk about how we're going to cooperate on ransomware. Also, while we were there, talked a little bit about how the United States can assist with our expertise and sometimes data against Russian war crimes. If you had told me when I took this job 20 years ago that I would one day get to work on war crimes, I would not have believed you, but I can tell you it's incredibly rewarding and the need is really there. The need is there because in some instances, electronic evidence is all they have. The Ukrainians don't have physical control over the crime scene. Think about how unusual that is for the police who normally work within their jurisdiction. They have control over the crime scene. In Ukraine, in some instances, they don't. So electronic evidence is the best way forward in those cases. So I want to talk a little bit about recapping what I did talk about in the fall of 2021. How did I do? Well, one thing I shared with you was that cybercrime was reported to the Internet Crime Complaint Center at 4.1 billion in 2020. That's just what gets reported to the FBI. And we all know underreporting is rampant, which is something I'm going to get to in a minute. What happened in 2021? Well, reports only went up 7%. So I said, well, you know, Mick, it'd be nice if you got those numbers going down, but at least, you know, 7% isn't rampant, right? Yeah, but losses were up 68%. They're now counting losses just in reported cybercrime to the FBI at $6.9 billion. And remember, everybody wants to talk about ransomware. I talk a lot about ransomware. It is a significant and dangerous threat. But 2.4 billion of that is business email compromise, when they are tricking your systems into making payments that go to the bad guys instead of to your vendors. So please don't lose sight of the business processes that you need to put in place to battle the routine stuff. There's so much money to be made. Criminals have not given up on that. I also predicted in the fall of 2021 that you would start to see the government move towards mandatory minimum cybersecurity standards. We talked a little bit, for those who got a chance to be in the roundtable that I participated in yesterday, about how I still think that's coming. It's not really here. Some of you are dealing with some standards. It's still sort of hit or miss, but especially those of you in critical infrastructure, I think are going to be dealing with more and more minimum cybersecurity standards. I also talked a little bit yesterday about my own feelings about whether that's the best model, whether the government really has the insight into the risks you face to be prescriptive about certain things. My fear that it could set a ceiling as well as a floor for what you should be doing to secure yourself. But I do think that movement continues to move forward on the government being more prescriptive in cybersecurity standards. I also thought that after nearly 20 years of congressional debate, we would see cyber incident reporting legislation. Remember I said that that figure for IC3 really was just what was being reported to the government, and we know that underreporting is rampant? Well, I don't know whether it will be complied with, but assuming it is, almost all of you now will have a legal requirement to in fact pick up the phone and call the government when you are the victim of a cyber attack. You heard A.D. Vorndran tell you about all of the resources that FBI wants to use to help you and what it does to be respectful of the other situations that you face to not put you in a worse position for having come to the government. That is our core belief. We are here to help. There are people out there old enough to remember that are laughing. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But the truth is we do want to help. And so one thing I'm very proud of is in that congressional legislation that passed, the reporting has a preservation of privilege provision. It's a little in the weeds for us lawyers, but basically, if you tell it to us, you can still protect it from telling it to other people. You don't all of a sudden get put in a worse place for having told us. So I was really glad to see that. I don't think it goes far enough. I think the implementation will be very important. We're working very closely with CISA on the implementation of that. And I think you're going to see a lot of developments and maybe even some modifications come as we gain experience with that. The last one I can't even get partial credit on. I said, I thought Russia would finally realize that it was in their national interest to cooperate with the United States on combating ransomware because it was important enough to the United States and had been elevated to the president level, and that they would not feel like protecting the cyber criminals who are profiting would be in their national interest. How did I do on that one? I didn't get even partial credit. Russia invaded Ukraine and things shut down, and it is having an impact. I'm sorry to report. We had a bilateral cyber dialogue with the Russians to see what we could do to make some progress, and that has in fact halted. I'm not saying that that is inappropriate. I think it's entirely appropriate that when Russia has invaded the sovereignty of its neighbors in such a grossly illegal way that we take actions to respond, and pausing the cyber dialogue is the least of the things that the US has done to respond. But I can tell you it has made things more difficult. We are back to our backup plans with regard to trying to get cyber criminals into justice. We still get them when they travel. They don't like to stay in Russia. They like to go to other places to spend their money, and we still get them when they do. But as you heard A.D. Vorndran speak about, we use lots of other tools to try to do things when we can't put somebody in custody. We do botnet takedowns, we do infrastructure takedowns, we also try to take their money back when we're able to do so. So just because we may not get them in handcuffs quickly, doesn't mean we won't. They still travel, and it doesn't mean there aren't other things we can do to help. So I want to move on from that to some of the things that are happening right now, and I will only have time to sort of tell you some of the processes that are going on so that if you are interested in them, you can plug into them. The first thing is, I heard some complaints yesterday in multiple roundtables. Where's the leadership? Where are the people telling us what the US national strategy is on cyber? Well, a lot of you know. We in fact created an Office of National Cyber Director in the White House for the first time. And the National Cyber Director is not here. It is not because he's not a Skunk Baxter fan. I imagine he probably is. It is because he and his entire team that he spent the past year staffing up with excellent people from across the government and industry are hard at work on a national cyber strategy. So if you are interested in that, I can't tell you everything I know about it, and I only have a small slice of it, but know that that is going on now, and it's being worked incredibly quickly, so now is the time for input. The other thing, a lot of you are going to say, look, that's not my area, but I want to encourage you to think of it as important to you. The United Nations has kicked off negotiations on a global cybercrime treaty. The United States for a long time has been part of a global cybercrime treaty that was first negotiated at the Council of Europe. It's called the Budapest Convention. It sets minimum standards for countries having outlawed certain bad cyber conduct, attacks and intrusions, has some baseline for the collection of electronic evidence, both real-time and stored communications, and it has some mutual legal assistance provisions so that people cooperate with one another on cybercrime. We think it's an excellent model, but Russia and China thought it did not go far enough, and they were able to convince the UN to kick off a binding worldwide instrument on cybercrime. You can imagine if we let Russia and China set the rules for the internet will look very different than American values. So the biggest procedural win the United States has had in that process was convincing the UN, which of course is a group of nation states, to allow multi-stakeholder participation. What is multi-stakeholder? Everybody who has a stake. You all have a stake in what the rules are for the internet. Do not let Russia and China write an instrument that guarantees state control over information, that has a sort of authoritarian goals that those countries have for the internet. You can participate in this, whether it's through industry groups, whether it's through hiring people like a Stuart Baker or Steve Ryan, or whether it's directly from your company going to New York or to Vienna, not bad places to be, and participating in these negotiations. I can't tell you how important it is. The UN can bind countries. So this is incredibly important. I've invested more resources in this than anything else we're doing. The next thing I do want to talk a little bit about is just cross-border access to data. You've heard people talk about being very concerned about other countries, particularly China, having access to Americans' data. A lot of times now, the poster child for that is TikTok. You've also seen for years the United States go out and tell other people what the risks to their data are if they use equipment from Chinese manufacturers like Huawei. China is out there giving away stuff to countries to get Huawei equipment into their networks. And the United States is aggressively trying to make sure that those countries know what the costs are of having that equipment embedded in their national infrastructures. But at the same time, we worry about China, others worry about us. Right now, the EU has an order that could shut down Facebook in Europe because they are concerned about US access to Europeans' data. We have to figure this out. If I said I'm spending the most resources on the UN negotiations, I'm spending the second most in my shop, not on ransomware. It's on access to electronic evidence across borders, trying to get the rules right, to say, look, those of us who respect human rights, those of us who have high standards for privacy, we should all agree what the rules should be, and then we should allow data to flow within those countries that join that group of rights-respecting countries. We're spending an incredible amount of effort in trying to make those improvements. It is an uphill battle. It is not going particularly well right now. But it impacts you all incredibly if you want to operate in multiple jurisdictions. There's just two more things that I want to talk about really briefly. And yes, I did tell the assistant director he could steal some of my time. So I validate that and I support it because I thought his presentation was fascinating and I came here to hear him. But two more things that I want to talk to you about briefly. I usually rant a little bit about the techno-anarchists when I get up here, and I'm not going to stop. So right now, we have both sides of the political spectrum that don't like certain law enforcement operations. You had one of the largest cable news hosts in the country telling his audience, delete your text messages every day. Get rid of electronic evidence. At the same time, you had one of the recognized more liberal members of Congress going out publicly and giving cyber self-defense advice to people to protect themselves against the possibility of being investigated for very unpopular laws that states can now put in place because of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision. So you had both sides of the spectrum telling people, stop law enforcement. I'm sorry, I don't think that leads us to a better path. I've dedicated 20 years to this. I believe in it. I think we need to empower law enforcement. You heard the congressman say he needs to see an internet where we have the ability to control bad conduct. We do not have that right now. The United States government is still funding operations like Tor that are the lifeblood of dark markets where fentanyl and other dangerous things are being sold. We aren't living in a world where we can control what happens on the internet. We can't even know who did what on the internet right now. I've seen a lot of emphasis in this administration on these problems, but I've seen a lot of the emphasis being on stopping authoritarian governments from doing bad things with the ability to access data. I have seen far less attention to improving the ability of rights-respecting governments who have the public interest, justice, and victims' concerns at their heart to be able to be more effective. I think we need to change that. In the meantime, we are leaving these decisions up to private companies. Many of you probably saw that Google recently announced that it will delete the location data that it has about its customers for locations that it deems to be sensitive. Those include abortion providers. That also, somewhat to my mystification, includes weight loss clinics. But Google's making the decision about what's sensitive. You notice they didn't include gun shops in that. They are instituting their own values into what data will be available to enforce the law. I think that's dangerous. I would rather live under the rules Congressman ISIS sets with his colleagues than under the United States of Google or Meta or Apple. And you all know how I feel about Apple. Very last thing that I'm going to leave you with. The last thing I asked you to think about in fall of 2021 was the benefits the United States gets globally from the importance of the US dollar and what the emergence of cryptocurrencies and other virtual assets might do to the United States' ability to enjoy that influence by the global domination of the dollar. Look at what's happening now. Russia invaded Ukraine. Yes, we've sent weapons to Ukraine, but we haven't sent our military to Ukraine to fight Russia. What have we done? We've sanctioned Russia. We have gone after assets, but we've also been very aggressive in using our control over the global economy through the US dollar to try to influence Russia's behavior. This is what I want to leave you with. What would have happened if the switch had already happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and cryptocurrencies were the global standard? Would we have done nothing? Or would we be in a hot war right now with Russia, all because of cryptocurrency? That's what I have for you folks. Thanks so much.